Hi. In this video, I tell you about the endocannabinoid system, what it is and what the system does. I say something about how cannabis with THC affects the endocannabinoid system. Then I tell you what happens when you take a break or stop using cannabis with THC. And then I give you a research-based guide to what you can do to strengthen the function of your endocannabinoid system. When numbers appear on the screen, that's a reference to the source that I base my statement on. So if you want to read further, you can find them down in the video description. My name is Kvillemo. I'm a researcher at the Center for Alcohol and Drug Research in Denmark. I've written a PhD about the use of cannabis as medicine in Denmark. And before I start talking about the endocannabinoid system, I need to say two things. The first thing I want to say something about is why we made this video. The video is part of a research project called CanInfo. And the idea for that project arose partly because I read this study of young people in Sweden who are interviewed about their cannabis use and their attitudes towards health information about cannabis. And the study concluded that young people want objective and neutral knowledge about cannabis. And when I read that study, I thought, heck yeah, I want that too. And I got the idea that we should try to make something like that. So my colleagues and I received some money from the Health Foundation in Denmark to research Danish youth's perceptions on cannabis use and to develop this information material that we adapted through interviews with the young people who use cannabis. So we made this video in Danish originally, and then we decided to make one in English too. The second thing I want to say something about is how I understand cannabis use, because I think it's important to define before I say anything else, really. So cannabis is used in many different ways, and not all cannabis use is problematic. So some cannabis use is recreational, like for fun. There are other types of cannabis use that's medicinal or medical. And these are some ways of using cannabis that can be relatively unproblematic. But for some, a cannabis use can develop into a problematic use. And then you can say, when is cannabis use actually problematic? And there are many opinions about this, and there are many definitions on addiction and problematic use. But one common feature is that you have a heavy use, which may be greater than you actually wanted it to be. And you may also experience an urge to use cannabis, that's also called cravings. You may feel a lack of control over use, and that use escalates. And you experience that cannabis takes up too much time in your everyday life and perhaps affects other things that you want to do. So the purpose of this video is not to tell anyone what to do, but to provide some knowledge about how cannabis affects the body, primarily through information about the endocannabinoid system. And if you yourself find that you have a problematic cannabis use and you're considering quitting, then there are some research-based tips on how to do so in this video. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get started. So cannabis affects us humans because cannabis can affect a system called the endocannabinoid system. And it's a system that was first discovered in the late 80s. And named after cannabis simply because the system was discovered when they started to investigate how the active substances in the plant, called phytocannabinoids, how they biochemically act on the human body. And it was actually quite surprising what they found, because they discovered that we have receptors that cannabis can act on virtually all of the cells we have in our bodies. We have this CB1 receptor that's mostly in the brain and the brainstem. And then we have this CB2 receptor that's primarily in the stomach and the intestines. And this CB1 receptor in the brain, it might be maybe the most abundant receptor available in the brain. And the system is not made to react to cannabis. It's not just sitting there in our bodies waiting for us to use cannabis. Everyone has the system and they use it every day. Our bodies make our own substances that fit perfectly with the system. These substances have also been found and described, and they're called endocannabinoids. Endo because they're produced inside the body. And it's these endocannabinoids that the cannabis plant can mimic. For example, our body makes a substance called anandamide, and it's this substance that THC can mimic. The difference between the two types of cannabinoids is that the endocannabinoids are released on demand, locally in the body and in small doses, whereas when you use cannabis from the outside, it hits the entire system. But both types of cannabinoids can activate the endocannabinoid system because they can affect the CB1 and CB2 receptors. Now, even though the system is amazingly comprehensive, there are some researchers who've tried to make a summary of what the system actually does in humans. And they say it's a system that helps us relax, eat, sleep, forget, and protect ourselves. So the way the system functions is actually super fascinating. So we have all these cannabinoid receptors on almost all of our cells, and we use them to fine-tune the communication that takes place in the body and in the brain. So you can actually think of the endocannabinoid system as a kind of a conductor for the entire neurochemical orchestra that's going on in your head. So for example, when there's something that's too noisy in there, then your endocannabinoids are activated in order to dampen what's noisy. So if we imagine that we can look into the brain and look at two of our cells right where they are talking to each other, where they're sending signals to each other and activating, and they do this by one cell spitting out neurotransmitters to the next cell, thereby turning it on, then there's activity. And when we want to dampen activity, when the cell wants to turn off that signaling again, it does so by communicating back to the cell that's talking. And it does so by producing cannabinoids that go up and hit our cannabinoid receptor on the other cell, which dampens the neurotransmitter activity. So it's stop talking or reduce activity. And we make a little bit of these endocannabinoids when necessary and only locally where the body is discovered there's too much noise here, there's too much activity. What happens when you use cannabis with the euphoric component, THC, is that THC gets out to all the cells in our entire body, and THC can mimic the endocannabinoids that we make ourselves, and therefore it can affect all of our endocannabinoid receptors simultaneously. So when you use cannabis with THC, you kind of hit an off switch or a dimmer switch on many different processes at the same time. So when you consider the summary given by endocannabinoid researchers on the system's function, they say it helps us relax, eat, sleep, forget, and protect ourselves. When you look at that summary, it kind of becomes clear that the system in many ways resembles the brake in a car. So when the accelerator is pressed and something is set in motion in the body, then the endocannabinoid system is activated to help us make sure that we brake again. With the caveat that our bodies are significantly more complicated than a car. The body can initiate many processes that are important for our survival. For example, it's important to be afraid or stressed so we can react quickly to danger. It's also important to feel pain so we can move away from whatever's hurting us. It's also important to be worried or anxious about something because you may be more pressured to act on what's making you worried. At the same time, it's important to be able to turn off these processes again so that we're not constantly afraid or in pain or anxious, because it costs our body a lot of resources to be in those processes. And we use the endocannabinoid system to turn off these processes again. And this is why it's important to have an endocannabinoid system that works properly, because it's so central in helping us relax, eat, sleep, and forget and repair ourselves. So research also shows that when the system is suppressed, when it's not functioning properly, our appetite is suppressed, and we have poor sleep quality, and we become more stressed and depressed. If you use cannabis with THC every day, then your body gets worse at relaxing and eating and sleeping on its own, and more dependent on THC from the outside to perform these functions. THC is one of these active substances in cannabis, the primary euphoric component in cannabis, and it can affect all the receptors in the endocannabinoid system, and this will trigger a noticeable activity in the system. It's also what we call being high. So being high is typically experienced as relaxing, where people often perceive things are more enjoyable or exciting. It's also common to have an increased appetite, feel more tired, and find it easier to fall asleep. However, these effects vary depending on the individual and the context. And for some people, the high is not associated with anything nice at all, but with psychological discomfort like anxiety or paranoia. Because THC has this direct and noticeable effect on the endocannabinoid receptors, it also has some consequences that can be relevant to know something about. Because in biology, there's simply no free lunches. And if you make a big effect in the body, it also has a consequence. And when you make a strong impact on the receptors in the system with THC from the outside, the system reacts to the fact that there's a lot of activity by adapting and removing some of the receptors. This has been seen in several different types of studies. It's been shown in animals and in the brains of deceased people. And it's also been shown in living people. For instance, in this study here, where they mapped the CB1 receptors in both in a group of people who use cannabis daily and in another group of people who did not use cannabis. And here they looked at whether there was a difference in the brains of between these two groups. And in the study, they found that there's significantly fewer CB1 receptors in the daily cannabis users in these brain areas that are colored yellow. So if you use cannabis with THC every day, there will over time be fewer cannabinoid receptors in the system that you can hit. And that's also why if you use cannabis over a long period of time, you find you become less high than you would in the beginning. That's also why if you use cannabis with THC over a long period of time, the body becomes worse at relaxing and eating and sleeping by itself, because your own cannabinoids, your own endocannabinoids, they don't have as many receptors left to hit, and therefore you become more dependent on THC from the outside to initiate all these functions. This is also why some cannabis users find it difficult to relax and fall asleep or work up an appetite unless they use cannabis with THC. So when you use cannabis with THC over a prolonged period of time, what you're actually doing is you're putting your stress and sleep break outside of your own body and asking cannabis to take care of these functions for you. Instead of it's your own body that's able to relax or get hungry or sleepy by itself. So if you experience this and you would like to reverse this development, there are some things you can do. So now we've been through the endocannabinoid system and how cannabis with THC affects the system. Now I want to tell you something about what happens when you take a break from using cannabis with THC. And I also want to show you what everyone can do to strengthen the function of the endocannabinoid system. So if you take a break from using cannabis with THC, the endocannabinoid system starts to dial up the receptors in the system again, but it takes some time, and we actually also have an idea of how long it takes. From the study I mentioned before, they persuaded about half of the daily cannabis users to stop using cannabis for 4 weeks and then get a brain scan again. And what they found in the study is that the receptor level will restore and back to a normal function within 4 weeks. So when you take a break from using cannabis with THC, the endocannabinoid system starts to restore the endocannabinoid receptors, and it takes about 4 to 6 weeks to get there. And during this adaptation period, you may experience some symptoms that could be uncomfortable, particularly in this phase 2 over here, where THC is on its way out of your body and the receptors in the system are still in the process of being restored. Right there from like a week and a half to 3 weeks, that's the period where people mostly experience symptoms. So let's look at these symptoms. Here's a list of symptoms people normally report when they stop using cannabis with THC. And you may get angry over small things that don't normally irritate you, so there's more irritability and aggression. You may also become more nervous and anxious. You may find it difficult to fall asleep, or you may sleep less or wake up early. Some experience like scary or very vivid dreams or nightmares. You may also have lack of appetite. Some people experience more restlessness. Also, some experience like headaches, stomach aches, and sore joints, so flu-like symptoms. And you may find that you have a worse mood than you normally do. And it's important to say here that people are different, and it's different from person to person how they react to taking a break from cannabis. So some experience no symptoms, others experience mild discomfort, and some experience many and noticeable symptoms. It's related to how much cannabis you've used, but it's really important to be aware that these symptoms are temporary, because you could easily get like 2 to 3 weeks into a cannabis stop and go like, fuck, is this how I'm going to feel now if I don't smoke cannabis? And it's really good to know that, no, you kind of have to go about the 5 to 6 week mark before you hit a normal stage. We also have some tips for getting through this adaptation period. So do something that you find fun or that you like. Do some self-care in this period. Do physical activity that makes your body tired. Tell somebody that you trust what you're experiencing. Perhaps ask for help sticking to your decision. That can help as well. Go to bed and get up at the same time every day. And prepare people around you for the fact that you might be a bit off for a few weeks. Another thing that can be helpful is to look at what's worked for others. And in this study, they talked to 119 cannabis users who stopped or reduced their use. And they've compiled a list of the most used strategies that they feel help them to gain control over their cannabis use. And the first one is cognitive strategies, which is really just a fancy psychology word for keeping a focus on what you want to achieve, so that you keep thinking about the benefits of gaining control over use, and you have positive thoughts about the fact that it can actually be done. Many of them also say they distract themselves with hobbies, other distractions. They also mention that they decrease time with other cannabis users and increase time with non-users. They draw on social support and help from others. They focus on work or school, or focus on diet and exercise. So during this blue adaptation period, where you have these symptoms and you're waiting for your cannabinoid receptors to come back to a normal level, there's actually something you can do yourself to boost the function of your endocannabinoid system from the inside, thereby taking the top of these symptoms that you're experiencing. And in fact, these are things that everybody can do if they want to improve the function of their endocannabinoid system. You can increase the production of cannabinoids, and here we're especially interested in making more of the substance called anandamide, which is abbreviated AEA. And we would like to make more of that because that's our body's own natural THC. So in this study, they reviewed research into what you can do to make more anandamide and boost the function of your endocannabinoid system. And there are several studies that show that moderate to hard physical exercise will increase the amount of anandamide in the body. For example, it's believed that anandamide is believed to be a contributing factor in the phenomena called runner's high, where you experience a feeling of happiness and euphoria from running for a long time. So go for a run, walk long distances in a brisk pace, or lift heavy things, or do any kind of hard physical activity, and you'll produce more anandamide. There's also research that suggests that some types of food can increase the amount of anandamide in the system. The probiotics or omega-3 fatty acids from like fish and nuts, and also fruits and vegetables with a high level of camphorol, which are found in berries and capers, cabbage and spinach. They may over time also boost the function of the endocannabinoid system. So there's also some research that suggests that the plant called echinacea, which is commonly used for colds, can increase the amount of anandamide. The same is true for the component in cannabis that's not psychoactive, cannabidiol or CBD. And the last thing they mention in this research article is relaxation. So our thoughts and feelings will affect our body. And when you're stressed, the neurotransmitters in the endocannabinoid system, the endocannabinoids, are suppressed. Therefore, techniques that help you relax, such as meditation, can probably also improve the function of the endocannabinoid system. That's all from me. Thank you for your attention. Thank you to the Health Foundation, Hälsofonden, and the Center for Alcohol and Drug Research for supporting the research project CanInfo that this video is a part of. We may make more videos like this. If you have ideas for other cannabis-related topics that you want to hear more about, then please write them in the comment section to this video. Thank you.